Chapter 1. Just another manic Monday. Josey couldn't stop yawning. It was still half an hour before dawn as he pulled his truck off Interstate 40 and headed north. Spitting out an old, heavily chewed piece of nicotine gum, he yawned again and glanced at his cup of steaming coffee. The gum was better than nothing. But he looked with longing at the glove box, where his pack of Winstons was stowed, as he drove on in the early pre-dawn darkness. Just got to make it until noon, then I can have a real cigarette followed by some serious sleep, he thought, as near exhaustion took its toll. The next stop would be only the fourth pickup of the morning, and yet he already felt dead tired. He reached for the coffee and felt the cup's comforting warmth in his hand. It had almost reached his lips when a jackrabbit, using that small animal logic that led millions of its predecessors to their untimely end, jumped out of the darkness into the dusty road ahead. It stood up on its hind legs and stared in mild curiosity when it was spotlighted by the truck's headlights. In mid-sip, Josey noticed the movement and turned the steering wheel sharply in an attempt not to hit the small animal. As the massive truck swerved, it jerked and shuddered, causing almost half of the coffee to spill onto his lap. Josey was suddenly very awake as he screamed, "Son of a bitch!" while the coffee scalded a tender area that no reasonable man would ever want burnt. The jackrabbit noted the bright lights and heard the squeal of the giant tires as the big thing racing toward it began to turn. Its whiskers twitched as its brown eyes widened a bit more, but otherwise, it remained motionless. The long-eared animal's only brief confused thought was, should I stay or leap? It didn't use reason or logic to decide. Instead, it chose to follow a natural instinct. Josey sucked through his clenched teeth as hot coffee soaked into his underwear like a sponge. The truck seemed destined to miss the long-eared innocent pedestrian, and he sighed in relief. But in mid-sigh, the jackrabbit chose an extremely unfortunate moment to take instinct advice, and leaped. The sheer size and weight of the truck made the bump almost imperceptible a moment later, but Josey knew he'd hit it. A wave of nausea and memories overcame him, even as he hit the brakes and pulled over to the side of the deserted road. He was 12 years old, standing at the bus stop waiting to go to school with his best friend. Tim had been followed by his new puppy named Blackjack. They'd been speculating about whether Sheila Cleveland was stuffing her bra or not when the bus started down the hill toward their pickup point. The puppy was yipping excitedly and bounding about with seemingly endless enthusiasm. The school bus was slowing to stop at the corner when Tim screamed, "No! No, Blackjack, stop!" But it was much too late. The puppy ran out in front of the bus, and the yellow-painted juggernaut on wheels ran it over. Had it killed the poor animal outright, Josey would no doubt have less disturbed memories about the accident, but it didn't. The weight and size of the mammoth tire crushed the puppy flat across its midsection. Blackjack howled in confused terror as blood and excrement was squished and squirted out onto the pavement. The dog's midsection was flattened, and deep tire tread marks were clearly visible in spite of the torn, bloody fur. It hadn't even been his dog, and yet Josey couldn't help throwing up as his friend Tim ran home screaming. The driver had obviously not been hired for her love of animals. She only shrugged while opening the bus door and said, "Shit happens. Let's get going." The feeling never changed with age. A fluttering, swirly sickness filled his stomach, and his throat felt like it was constricting to a point where it was nearly impossible to breathe. Josey was not the most tender-hearted man, but knew he had to go back to see that the jackrabbit was dead and not just laying in the road suffering. He reached for his crowbar and climbed out of the truck cab. The heavy 4-foot-long rusty rod of metal was slightly moist from the condensation in the early morning air. He walked back, gripping it tightly in both hands. His throat constricted tighter with every step. The smell of the giant septic tank attached to the back of the truck wasn't as bad as it would be in a few hours, once the New Mexico sun began cooking the contents. The truck held a large silvery-colored metal storage tank painted on both sides with a large cartoon skunk sniffing a bouquet of roses. Some people back at the office referred to the giant septic tank draining trucks as honey wagons, but he never did. It seemed pointlessly stupid. Draining septic tanks wasn't his first career choice, but it was a job. A job he didn't really mind doing, usually. And yet as he walked back to check on the jackrabbit, he wondered how his life ever came to this point. Standing in the middle of nowhere on a deserted road, listening to the septic tank contents sloshing around from the sudden unexpected stop, Josey sighed. He didn't bother holding his breath as he continued back to the rear of the truck. Of course, he rarely noticed the aroma anyway. His sense of smell was so bad, he usually had to tell by other people's expressions when he needed a shower. It was just another perk of having driven a septic tank truck for the last 3 years. In the pale pre-dawn, Josey saw the lump of fur just a few yards behind the truck. He swallowed hard and walked slowly closer. His hands shook as a part of his mind feared that the animal might leap up and bite him, giving him some nasty disease, maybe even rabies. He gripped the cold crowbar tightly, but was ready to run back to the cab of his truck should it attack. In the dim red glow of the taillights and the pale pre-dawn, it was hard for him to see the body very well. He reached out to poke the furry lump with the crowbar before remembering the small flashlight tucked inside his coveralls pocket. Backing up a step, he pulled it out and clicked it on. The white light shined on the cold, black, dusty asphalt. It illuminated a small, shockingly bright red stream of blood flowing from the furry lump. But is it still alive? He wondered, following the trail of blood with the beam of light until it showed a mass of pink intestines and fur. He felt his stomach bucking as his breakfast shot out of his mouth. His whole body shuddered and shook as he vomited uncontrollably for several agonizing seconds. He turned off the flashlight while continuing to lose his breakfast. Some things, like vomiting, are best done in darkness. At least it's not as bad as throwing up drunk, he thought. Before adopting his current profession, Josey briefly attended a university and knew all too well the unpleasantness associated with throwing up while drunk. A toga party hosted by the football boosters was both the first and last time he'd ever gotten seriously drunk. He'd spent the afternoon at practice, and by the time the coach let the team go, the party was already in full swing. Most of the guys went straight to the festivities, but the smart ones ate something before they began drinking. Josey had not been one of the smart ones. As a result of being raised in a strict Southern Baptist family, he'd been denied an education in alcohol that most of his Methodist friends were privy to. When he was a teenager, a big time with alcohol was limited to occasionally drinking a mixture of cough syrup and ginger ale. His friends called the vile-tasting concoction a Dr. Shirley Temple. It was a nasty excuse for a cocktail, but on the plus side, he never minded being homesick with a cold when he was a kid. At the toga party, he wore a large, mostly white bedsheet with a few stains, the origins of which were best not considered. Josey made up for a wasted non-alcoholic childhood and tried a little bit of everything. The football boosters had set up tables with nearly every kind of liquor he could imagine, and not a single cough syrup bottle was in sight. It was paradise. A large mug of white wine was followed by a few shots of tequila, vodka, scotch, and gin, plus several plastic cups of beer from a keg were the last things he vaguely recalled about that night. It wasn't until several hours later that he realized drinking vast quantities of different types of alcohol on an empty stomach was not a particularly good idea. The next day, his friend Al showed him a video of his exploits from the night before that he'd uploaded to the internet. Josey didn't remember standing on a table shouting that he was Zeus, but the video didn't lie. The vivid color quality was quite impressive, as it showed him projectile vomiting on various football booster businessmen, most of whom were wearing very expensive-looking suits, that had also attended the toga party. Leaning against the rear of the truck's tank, he finished losing his breakfast and then wiped his face with a handkerchief. He used the long crowbar to push the dead animal's carcass off to the side of the road before walking unsteadily back to the truck cab. Breathing hard and still trembling, he replaced the crowbar and climbed inside. At least the day can't get much worse than this, he hoped. After swishing the remaining coffee around in his mouth, he spit it back in the cup and poured the foulness out the window. He restarted the engine and drove away, trying to think of something, anything, other than the last few minutes. "I tried to miss it. I really did," he mumbled as he drove past a closed convenience store and turned off the empty country highway onto a dirt road. The truck rumbled past an old wooden sign rotted with decades of neglect. It had partly fallen over and had the words Albuquerque Springs Trailer Park painted on it. The words were faded and almost impossible to read at a casual glance. In fact, it had taken Josey 3 attempts before he finally discovered that's where the trailer park rode was the first time he came for a pickup. After 2 miles, he downshifted and began the steep run into the canyon. Some people referred to it as a valley, but to him, it always seemed more like a miniature Grand Canyon. From on top of the valley, the first rays of the sun started to peek over the landscape. The sunlight reflected off the trailers below, and he wondered how the place managed to stay in business at all. At the bottom of the valley, the park was large enough to accommodate several hundred mobile homes. Decades ago, there used to be that many before the new interstate made the old dusty highway he'd spent the last 30 minutes navigating nearly deserted. Albuquerque Springs Trailer Park was one of the saddest-looking places Josey ever visited. He tried to remember. Were there 10 or 11 trailers with residents left? 8 or 9 trailers were full of illegal immigrants. They came from everywhere. There were people living there from all over South and Central America, as well as Mexico. They lived together and saved money to send home to their families. One of the more artistic residents had even made a large plywood sign, painted red, white, and green, and installed it on top of the first trailer. The sign read, "Welcome to New Mexico." Josey's throat tightened when another jackrabbit leaped across the steep road ahead and felt that deep, heavy, uneasy pain in his stomach again. Who else was still down in the valley? He wondered and reached for another piece of gum. He chewed at the bitter-tasting stuff, wishing he could smoke, but knew it was dangerous in a truck carrying as much natural methane as his did. Glancing at the old tattered piece of paper someone had thoughtfully taped to the dashboard that had the words, "No smoking." He shot it the birdie finger and considered those few people that still lived down in the valley. There was an old guy who was probably retired. He'd seen him using a cane while walking a poodle near a bright, shiny silver 1960s-era trailer that had an American flag on a pole out front. The old man had seemed nice enough as they exchanged waves. And then there was Mrs. Remlap. Josey shuddered at the thought of her. She was old, mean, ugly, and just plain rude. She always had a snide comment or sarcastic backhanded compliment for him. He trembled after remembering he had to see her this morning to pick up a payment for draining the park's septic tank. Her house was hard to miss. It sat on the far side of the valley. It was a big, ancient, 2-story, termite-infested, somewhat dilapidated-looking house. It always reminded him of that movie with the Bates Motel and some weird guy who dressed in his dead mom's clothes. The Remlap house was situated on a little bluff. 30 or 40 years earlier, it may have seemed like a mansion, lording over its mobile home residents. But that early morning as he stared at the old house, it was at best a depressing sight, at worst kind of frightening. For an empty trailer park, it sure is full of junk, Josey thought, looking at the piles of rubbish stretching across the valley floor. There were shopping carts, some full of bits of metal that had probably been salvaged or stolen, stacks of recycled crumbly-looking cinder blocks, bicycles, rusty barrels, an old Yugo car with a flame paint job along its sides, and just plain old trash scattered everywhere. There were also more than a few abandoned trailers, rusting cars or pieces of cars, and lots of broken appliances. In many ways, the whole trailer park looked more like a junkyard than a place people actually lived. He finally noticed the birds while driving the last switch back on the steep road leading into the valley. Never before had he seen so many. The closest trailers, the ones the illegal immigrants used, were surrounded by thousands of the birds. There are some big ones too, he realized, staring at a giant buzzard or vulture sitting atop the nearest trailer. He wasn't sure what the difference was anyway regarding carrion birds, but guessed it must have at least a 5-foot wingspan. Slowing to enter the trailer park gate, the truck passed between two old cars nearly blocking the road ahead. He wondered briefly if someone had crashed them together. One was a dark green station wagon, the other a big cargo van, and both were older vehicles with beer cans and tequila bottles on the dashboard and scattered around them. The van had part of a broken utility pole leaning on its badly dented roof. He stepped on the gas pedal when a man started to get out of the station wagon. Josey didn't want to talk to a drunk first thing in the morning, or really any other time of the day for that matter. The truck had gone a few hundred yards when he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw behind him several other men standing around the wrecked cars. "I sure hope they don't want to ride into town." After another minute, he pulled the truck into the laundry building parking lot and flipped on the generator switch for the pumps. He slid on his thick, dirty pair of leather work gloves. Climbing out, he reached for the thick, smelly rubber hose and dragged it to the septic tank cap near the dilapidated laundry building. The roof had fallen in from disrepair long ago, and Josey only shook his head as he hooked up the hose connections. Sheets of paper fluttered in the wind on his clipboard while he looked them over. According to the invoice, it had been 3 months since the last pickup. After double-checking the connections between the hose and truck, he flipped on the pump. He'd learned the extremely messy way, the undeniable need to always double-check septic tank hoses. A couple of years earlier, after his probationary period was up, he'd felt cocky and confident when it came to his job. Until the infamous Vaughn incident, that is. The Vaughn family had a custom-built mansion located on the outskirts of Albuquerque. It had cost almost $2 million, and everything about it screamed money. They had stables, horses, a pool, and almost 20 acres of land north of town. The only thing they had gone cheap on was the septic tank system. It had backed up and they called for help. Josey was met by a valet that showed him a back road where his truck wouldn't be as noticeable by the wedding reception guests. As he climbed out of the truck, he heard music and laughter coming from the other side of a concrete wall which surrounded a large pool. The Vaughn's wedding reception was in full swing as Josey ran the hose to their septic tank plug. He heard someone giggle as he started to make the final connections and turned around. It was a pair of blonde girls that looked quite cute, and he guessed they were about 19 years old. They were wearing bikinis that left very little to the imagination, and Josey smiled at them as he wondered what kind of kinky wedding reception was going on. His heart almost stopped when they both smiled back. They asked if he wanted anything to eat, and of course he said yes. Before following them to the pool, he flipped the pump switch on. A minute later, Josey was filling a paper plate with food and swaying slightly to the music. He didn't immediately hear the screams that began growing in volume all around him. But when he turned back to the pool, with a piece of fried chicken in his mouth, there was a spray of human bodily wastes splashing down from the sky. The dozens of guests, many in expensive clothing, were splattered with a foul, smelly concoction of septic tank contents. It was a bad day. A faulty hose coupler was responsible for the fiasco. Luckily for Josey, the owner of the septic tank draining company already hated Jasper Vaughn, head of the Vaughn household, for a variety of previous business disagreements. If it had been any other customer than him, Josey certainly would have been fired. As it was, he was only lightly reprimanded by the owner, who had a hard time keeping a straight face during his lecture on the importance of being more careful in the future. The familiar chugging sound of the septic tank pumps made him feel better as he closed his eyes and leaned back against the big truck's storage tank. It was more than half full, and the cool metal felt good on his back. He made a mental note to buy more nicotine gum and gasoline after he left the trailer park. Yawning hugely, he briefly considered getting his lunch out of the truck. But ultimately, Josey decided to wait since his stomach was still queasy from the unfortunate rabbit experience. He checked his clipboard and saw he only had 3 more pickups to do. After that, he could go home and sleep for the rest of the day. Josey had been draining tanks since a little after midnight that morning, but didn't mind, since it was much cooler working at night than in the unrelenting heat of day. A cloud of flies were attracted to the delicious aroma of the truck's contents and began congregating in greater numbers. He squinted and walked through the growing swarm of excited insects. When he could see clearly, he continued on toward the roofless laundry building. Looking through the doorway, he saw a big room about 30 by 60 feet. The walls were made of concrete blocks. A dark doorway going God only knew where was in the middle of the far wall. There were the old rusting remains of 24 washing machines and dryers, an old candy machine, a broken TV, lots of roofing shingles, rotted boards with rusty nails poking out of them, and a sizable collection of smashed bottles in the room. What a nasty mess, he thought, shaking his head. He imagined that years ago this was probably the safest place to be if a tornado was coming. But where do the people go today in a storm? Probably just hunker down and pray, he thought, looking up at the sky. It was a dark purple color to the west, and as he looked back toward the rising sun, he saw a deep blue sky making its entrance. Josey smiled, thinking, no tornadoes in sight. It's going to be a beautiful day. Josey was still staring at the dark blue and purple sky when he heard the truck pump's chugging sound change pitch. It was sucking dry. The swarm of flies was more than he'd seen in a long time. He grumbled, "Damn, forgot to spray myself with bug spray. They're going to eat me alive." Pinching his nose shut, having learned long ago the hard way that flies will go up your nose if you don't, he ran for the truck. The flies were everywhere and piloting into his eyes, hair, ears, nose, and mouth. It was disgusting, and they would sometimes bite. Squinting, he hurried through the cloud of flies until he found the pump switch and shut it off. The pump fell silent. The buzzing swarm of flies and the cawing sounds of birds mixed together in a way that made him feel momentarily confused and a little dizzy. Josey stumbled and ran back away from the truck to where the hose was still attached to the septic tank. He ran into someone and heard them fall with a thud. The flies had thinned out enough for him to catch his breath and open his eyes. Quickly gasping for air, he looked down at the man he knocked over in his blind dash, away from the flies. The man was face down on the ground, wearing a torn, long-sleeved, dirty blue and white checkered shirt, dirty blue jeans, red bandana, and a greasy baseball cap, but no shoes. Josey saw the man's bare feet were all scratched and covered in open cuts and lesions. He must be drunk, he realized, and reached down to shake the man's shoulder. "Hey, you okay?" The stranger got slowly to his hands and knees as Josey reached down to help him up. His hand was only inches away when the man seized it with frightening strength. Josey gasped when he saw the man's bloody fingers and his skin, which appeared grayish-black and looked as if it had been torn at by dogs. The stranger's fingernails dug into his hand and, even through the thick leather gloves, he felt them stabbing his hand. "Hey, damn it, knock that shit off and let go, dickweed," he yelled, yanking his hand free of his grasp. It was at that moment that he got his first look at the man's face. Face? Well, yes, once it may have been a face, but now it looked a lot like what was left of the rabbit this morning, minus its furry cuteness. Josey squealed in a very unmanly fashion and gagged at the same time as he fell backward, shocked and nauseated. The now standing man started to walk toward him. Josey could often be heard to say, usually at a bar after a few drinks, "My mama raised a lot of hell, but she never raised a coward who would turn tail and run from any man." As Josey kept backing away thinking about that phrase, he decided he'd never use it again if he managed to survive the next few minutes. That boast sometimes ended a fight before it began. Although it sometimes set off a brawl if the other guy was a jerk that made some suggestion about other rather impolite things, that Josey's mama used to do. "Nope, never saying that again," he muttered to himself and quickly turned to run. "Sons of bitches," he shouted as he felt and heard his knee pop out of joint. It was the same exact agonizing pain as when it had hyperextended like it did last month while he'd been playing basketball. He fell onto the ground and screamed, "Damn it!" in blind pain, sprawled face down on the dusty pavement. Flies buzzed and flew into his face, making him gag. He exhaled forcefully through his nose, trying to evict the flies, which had already started exploring his nostrils. In a normal situation, he'd have taken the time to carefully pop the knee back in place. But under the circumstances, he didn't think there was the luxury of time. The stranger was on his feet, grunting and moving toward him. Rolling onto his back, Josey looked up as the man came closer. Clenching his teeth, he pulled the disjointed knee with his hands and felt it pop back into its proper place. Knowing that it might pop out of joint again, he pulled himself backward and scooted awkwardly across the dusty pavement on his butt. He was moving as quickly as he could toward the truck's cab as the stranger followed. More flies began investigating his mouth and nose. Josey gave up worrying about them. Yes, they were disgusting and unpleasant, but there are only so many things a person can deal with at one time. The strange man followed while he searched his mind for a better or more accurate word. It may have been a man at one time, but now it was what? A monster. Okay, sure, a monster. But what kind is he? Josey thought frantically, backing steadily toward the truck's cab, unwilling to turn his back on the strange early morning monstrosity. The man-like thing that walked toward him seemed to be smiling. Yet the large patches of missing skin on his face made it hard to be certain. Josey thought of those late-night movies he'd watched as a kid, after his parents thought he'd gone to sleep. What's that guy supposed to be, a damn zombie? It can't be. A walking corpse was the stuff of nightmares and cheesy paperback books, not a Monday morning at an old trailer park just outside of Albuquerque. Yet here it is, he thought, while frantically hoping it was all just a bad dream. Josey gagged as he scooted back deeper into the swarm of flies. While they began flying in and around his mouth and nose in greater numbers, he felt almost certain this had to be a nightmare. His vision was obscured as he coughed and felt more nauseated while scooting away from the approaching figure. Not being able to see with the swarm of flies all around him, he reached up and felt for the truck's door handle. Gagging and spitting out flies, he painfully opened the door and managed to climb up into the truck cab. After slamming and locking the door shut, he noticed a good-sized cloud of ravenous flies were trapped inside the cab with him. He grabbed the can of bug spray and didn't pause a moment to consider the label's dire warning printed in big red letters of using only in a well-ventilated area. Instead, he quickly pressed the button and sprayed poison all over himself and the cab of the truck. Josey coughed on the fumes as he wiped his face and blew a few flies out of his nose into his handkerchief. He heard a tapping sound and saw the man standing outside. His fingers were sliding all over the door's window, leaving dirty, dark red blood trails on the glass. "That's it! I'm leaving!" he shouted, starting the truck and wrestling the transmission into first gear. Swearing, he glanced ahead and saw a group of men coming. He didn't take time to count, but there had to be at least 20 of them, and they were within a few seconds of reaching the truck. As he got the transmission into gear, he yelled at the horde of apparent trailer park zombies, "Adios, motherfuckers!" The truck lurched forward and died so suddenly and completely, he almost started to cry. He thought maybe he had it in the wrong gear and looked down at the stick shift. But it was in first gear as he pressed down the clutch and tried to restart the engine. "What the?" he started to say before slapping his forehead in realization. "The damn drain hose is still hooked up to the septic tank. Shit," he swore while turning the key again as the engine sputtered, yet refused to start. "The engine's flooded. This is so fucked up," Josey muttered, never being known for understating the obvious, while continuing to turn the key with no success. The men surrounded the truck cab, and some climbed up onto the hood. It's just like one of those stupid damn movies, he thought, while purposely not looking at their faces as his stomach churned uneasily. If he did look at them, he knew he'd throw up again. What confused and frightened him, almost as much as their appearance, were the sounds coming from the mangled group of former men, now apparently zombies. In the movies, they're usually mute or moaning. But the undead men were mostly making a weird grunting noise, or yelling and screeching. Those noises were accompanied by the sound of fists and scratching fingers as they continued to beat on the truck. A loud scream, followed by several others, forced Josey to look around frantically. The passenger side window was hit by a large brick and cracked. The engine continued to sputter as he pumped the gas and shouted, "Come on!" The passenger side window shattered to tiny pieces as the brick wielder swung again. In a matter of seconds, a thin, wiry man was crawling in through the broken window. He moved fast and screamed while crawling across the bench seat toward Josey. If he had a gun, he would have happily shot him, but since all he had was a can of bug spray, he used that. The poisonous spray coated the wiry man from his bloody eyes to his mouth. The undead man momentarily appeared confused before tearing at his eye sockets, while screaming and gibbering nonsensical sounds. Digging and scratching at his eyes with his fingernails, the wiry man howled louder as bright red blood began to flow down his cheeks. Josey whacked him on the side of his head with the heavy metal toolbox, shouting, "No! Get out! No!" The wiry man stopped screaming and tearing at his eyes. He shook his head and started crawling forward again, sniffing loudly as blood continued to pour out of his ruined eye sockets. That was more than enough for Josey. He snatched up his pack of nicotine gum and his toolbox before shoving open the driver's side door with as hard a push as he could manage. Several of the apparent zombies fell over backward and into others. He climbed gingerly out, favoring his bad knee, and pulled his long crowbar from behind the driver's seat. Using the crowbar as a cane, he limped shakily a few yards away and thought quickly about his extremely limited number of options. The Remlep house was much too far away, but what about the trailers? He glanced over his shoulder at the old man's silvery trailer and realized it was also too far, at least a quarter mile away, and his knee was trembling and throbbing painfully even as he stood there. When the pack of undead surged toward him, a few started screeching loudly and moved much faster than the rest, perhaps somehow sensing Josey's lack of escape routes. Out of options, he was about to swing the crowbar at the nearest man when he remembered the laundry building. Josey limped backward and tried not to trip or hurt his knee any worse than it already was. He moved slowly, but thankfully, most of them were slower. The man he sprayed had somehow gotten out of the truck and ran through the crowd of slower-moving men, knocking a few onto the ground as he came. Sniffing the air with great intensity, the blinded man clutched the can of bug spray in one hand. Josey leaned against the big metal tank on the back of the truck. He swung and hit the fast-moving blinded man with the crowbar. The iron bar struck him on the side of his head. It wasn't much of a hit, but he dropped the can of bug spray and fell back into the crowd of pursuers. Multiple screams were coming from all directions, and Josey limped faster. Stepping through the doorway of the dilapidated building, he tried to avoid the nails and boards which almost blocked the entry entirely. After hobbling inside, he tossed more boards and various other bits of junk into the doorway and looked quickly around the room. He saw the long row of washers and dryers and carefully made his way over to the old rusting machines. The dryers were much lighter than the washers, as he well knew from his last job delivering appliances for Loco Larry's retail outlet. He yanked and pulled on one of them as he heard the boards and other debris in the doorway being pulled down and knocked aside. Grunting and yanking harder on the rusty machine, he felt it snag on the power cord. Glancing over his shoulder, he saw one of the men halfway inside was crawling through the debris, while others pushed and tried to climb over him. "Come on, you big bastard," Josey grunted. When he felt the power cord rip away from the rusty machine, he heaved as hard as he could and sent the dryer flying through the air into the doorway. It landed with a terrific metallic crash on top of the man who had fallen and been crawling inside. He seized the next dryer in line, pulled harder, and felt the cord again rip loose from the wall. Hefting the dryer as a smaller man might toss a bale of hay, he threw it with fairly good accuracy on top of the other one in the doorway. The door of the dryer sprang open, and a somewhat faded, multicolored collection of long ago abandoned panties and bra fell out. Everyone thought being a big guy was a blessing, but Josey knew better. With the exception of being able to make a barricade out of a collection of rusty major appliances during a thankfully rare zombie attack, being a big man sucked. Standing over 6 feet tall, he'd occasionally suffered back pains and even managed to throw it out completely a couple of times. Plus, when you're tall, it's much farther when you fall down to the ground, whether due to a bout of drinking or being surprised by a pack of apparent zombies on an early Monday morning. Finally, there was Josey's most hated thing about being big and tall: short bastards that wanted to impress someone by starting a fight to demonstrate how tough they were. It was more annoying than anything else. Little guys would sometimes come up, bump into him on purpose, and try to start a fight when all Josey wanted was a few minutes to enjoy a beer or hang out with some friends at a bar. Typically, he always tried to follow the golden rule. However, when pushed too far, Josey had many times managed to send several short guys with an inferiority complex to various medical facilities. Of course, Josey knew, the dirty little secret is that it's always a winning scenario for the little guy who gets a big guy to fight him. If the little guy wins, it's always a David versus Goliath victory. But even if he gets the snot kicked out of him, the little guy still can come away saying the big guy wouldn't have won if they'd both been the same size. Josey limped back over to the doorway and spotted a man's head and groping arms under the bottom dryer. The men or zombies, Josey hadn't made up his mind what they were yet, were shoving the top dryer. Unless somehow braced in place, it would soon slide off. His knee still throbbed and shook unsteadily while he considered the much heavier washing machines. He was sure they'd never be able to move one of them. The only problem was if he tried to lift them, he could hurt himself worse, and maybe even throw out his back. The all too horrifically plausible possibility of ending up lying on his back in a dilapidated building, surrounded by dozens of zombies, convinced Josey not to try it. He leaned his crowbar against the dryers in the doorway and quickly looked around the room. The candy machine's front glass had long ago been broken out, but its large 6 by 3 foot metal frame seemed fairly sturdy, if not overly heavy. After climbing over boards and broken glass, he pulled on the big machine. It was heavier than it looked and hard to maneuver, but with the fear-fueled adrenaline pumping through his system, Josey somehow managed to push it over onto its side. He was pushing the rusty machine toward the doorway when there was a metallic crash caused by the top dryer falling back into the laundry room. With several feet left to reach the doorway, he saw a man already climbing over the bottom dryer, with others pushing and starting to follow him inside. "Come on, give me a break," he muttered, realizing they'd be in the room before he got to the entrance unless he dealt with them first. He hobbled over to the dryers and picked up the crowbar that had fallen. Turning back to the doorway, he saw the first man fall into the room as 2 more climbed over the bottom dryer. The boards creaked and snapped as he gingerly crossed over them and swung the crowbar like a baseball bat. He aimed at the man that had already fallen into the room. "Will you guys just drop dead?" he shouted, swinging the crowbar. It slammed into the man's torso, simultaneously making a sickening crunch and a juicy wet sound. The man flew backward and knocked one of the 2 men still climbing on the dryer back out through the doorway. The other fell into the laundry room, and he recognized him as the stranger with the ruined, bleeding eyes he'd sprayed in the truck with insect spray. His sore knee started to spasm and he gasped in pain. Losing his balance, he fell toward the wall nearest the door. He dropped the crowbar, grabbed onto a board propped next to the wall to keep from falling, and felt a rusty 6-inch nail pierce his hand. Screaming in pain, he looked at his leather-gloved hand as several men outside the building screamed as if in response. "Shut the hell up," he yelled back through the doorway. The bloody metal nail point poked out a couple of inches through the palm of his hand. As he stared at it, he no longer felt fear as much as a growing anger. Watching the blinded man stagger past him and deeper into the room, apparently unable to tell where he was, Josey bit his lip and yanked his hand back off the nail. He felt it slide sickeningly back through his flesh and thought, "If all that happens to me today is tetanus, I'll be the happiest septic tank drainer in the whole damn world." Josey was growing tired. He was panting and reaching for the fallen dryer again when he felt something grasp a hold of his leg from behind. He fell with his back against the wall and barely avoided slamming his shoulder into the same nail-protruding board. Looking down, he saw the man pinned under the dryer, pulling on his right pant leg. The man couldn't stand and yet held stubbornly on to his pants. There was a glint of steel, and Josey realized the crowbar was pinned half under its body. "You won't be happy until someone bashes in your damn head, will you?" he asked, grabbing the long board with the nail in it, careful not to stab himself again. Josey swung it at the man's head. It hit with a loud cracking noise, and his head split open like a rotten, soft-boiled egg. A foul stench filled the air as his greyish-green-coloured brains spilled through the shards of bone, which were all that remained of the skull. Josey felt his stomach almost heave again as he saw the others had already started coming back inside. Josey swung the board toward the entrance where the others were climbing inside once more. It knocked them back through the doorway. He threw the board after them, shouting, "Piss off! Go eat someone else. I saw some fat cripples in wheelchairs just down the road. Go get them." Grabbing onto the fallen dryer, he lifted it, using his good leg as much as possible, and crammed it tightly into the doorway. He wedged it in hard so it wouldn't slip off as easily. Taking a minute, he double-checked the man who had made it in with his mangled eyes. He was on his back making pitiful grunting noises several yards away, apparently having fallen over some debris and getting himself stuck. Josey ignored him and limped slowly back to the candy machine. As he reached out to grab it, he noticed his right glove had begun dripping red splotches of blood, and his hand felt numb. Swearing a long stream of colourful profanities, he pushed the machine the last few feet and propped it against the dryers in the doorway. Still not satisfied with the improvised barricade, he jammed boards against both the candy machine and the dryers. After another few minutes of work on the doorway, he retrieved his crowbar and went over to the blind man tangled in the debris of the collapsed roof. He never imagined it possible to feel pity for a zombie, but as he stared down at the sightless man, yelping and pulling fruitlessly at his bleeding leg, which was entangled in the rafters scattered on the floor, he couldn't help himself. He heard the men outside, mostly grunting. Others continued to scream as they pounded at the barricade, while he looked down at the closest one and studied him. Josey couldn't help being reminded of the rabbit he'd killed earlier. The man with the ruined eyes continued to try and get loose from the boards while yelping almost like a pitiful animal caught in a trap. There was a thought itching at the back of Josey's mind as he stared down, yet he couldn't make it clearer no matter how hard he tried. He sneaked over to the yelping zombie and raised the crowbar, prepared to crush his head. His shadow fell on the man's horribly mangled, bleeding face, and it turned to look up at him, unseeing, but staring nonetheless. The horrible thought finally clarified as the crowbar smashed his head and blood flowed. He wasn't a zombie. He was alive. He saw the tears that had been leaking from his ruined eye sockets and down his cheeks, while pulling the crowbar out with a disturbing crackling of bones. He wiped the blood off on the dead man's shirt and felt his stomach rumbling and his throat tightening. "I will not throw up," he whispered. Looking up at the flawless blue sky, he took several deep breaths, then picked up his toolbox and sat down on a washing machine. From the box, he pulled out a small first aid kit and found the antibiotic cream and bandages. Having dealt with all kinds of septic tank-related jobs over the last few years, Josey knew all too well the importance of having a good first aid kit when working in the field. After painfully removing his glove, he tried to ignore the sounds of the men scratching, grunting, screaming, and beating on the barricade. Popping a fresh piece of nicotine gum in his mouth, he bandaged his hand while trying to figure out what was going on. He remembered seeing a few of the men outside were missing fingers, hands, arms, or huge strips of flesh from their bodies, yet they hadn't been bleeding. Are they all alive? Are they dead and yet able to bleed? Are they somewhere in between? His mind swirled, but no matter what the explanation might be, he realized the why was far less important than the how. How the heck am I going to get out of here? After wrapping the bandage tight, he leaned his head back against the wall and tried to think. He pulled his cell phone out of his khaki coveralls pocket and flipped it open. The little screen displayed the words, "No signal." He flipped it shut and looked over the top of the walls of the ruined building, at the high hills on all sides of the valley, and wondered, what do I do now?